Hello there, Twitch chat. I hope you're having a very nice day. We just thought we'd stop by and let you know that we're starting a Patreon. It's going to have all kinds of crazy things. You'll be able to see my feet pics. And of course, you'll get access to early scripts, and you might even be able to vote on a new video or two. Anyway, stick around for the feature presentation. I hate Saw 7. Or Saw 3D, or Saw the Final Chapter, or whatever. I'm going to call it Saw 7. It makes me irrationally angry. The terrifying fall in quality between 6 and 7 is insane to think about. There are a few examples in horror history where the quality between entries is so stark, even though it's made by essentially the same team. And what's worse, it's the most expensive one of the original 7, and it feels the cheapest by a wide margin. It's more of a money laundering scam than an actual movie. With Saw X having released, I've been thinking about the franchise again, its many strengths and weaknesses, its soap opera narrative, and its place within horror history. Ever since my first viewing though, Saw 7 has been lodged in my brain like a reverse bear trap. So, as with Saw 6, I'm making this video so I never have to think about it ever again. Saw 7 is not a disaster piece, a film that's accidentally super interesting. It's just a straight up disaster. And don't feel offended if you like this movie, it's designed to be fun for fans after all, but in our own opinion, it's so bad that it hurts our souls. We don't want anyone to think any less of this movie, we just want you to think about it more. Chapter 1, Bad Horror Sequels. Once I get into the zone, it'll be like, Angus, slow down.
Look out! That's on camera.
That's on camera, that's great. See, I told you this is a dangerous saw trap. Look at this damn thing. It's gonna collapse on me if I don't do this video quickly enough. It's not a stretch to say that late-era horror sequels are some of the worst movies ever made. You know, devoid of fresh ideas, frequently tedious, and existing solely to wring money out of a rotting corpse. There's only so much innovation one can conjure out of a guy killing some kids over and over. Remember, Saw 6 is the exception to the rule. It's the rare sequel that finds a second wind. Even if it's a bit stupid, it has an energy behind it, and that makes for captivating drama. You know, captivating because you are left captive to think non-stop about how bizarre the choices were. To explore what makes Saw 7 an arduous experience to sit through, I want to compare and contrast with some other bad horror sequels. Late horror sequels tend to fall into two overarching categories, poignant and pointless. This does not simply refer to being good and bad. The new Halloween sequels are very well made, but yet they are often dull. And there are horror sequels that aren't very good but are nonetheless very entertaining.
Ted! Hey, Ted, where the hell's corkscrew?
This dichotomy that we've just thrust into your face is a touch more nuanced than that. At this stage in a franchise, fan expectations aren't particularly high. They return to these pictures because they're safe and comfy, even if the comfort is watching a cop yell at another cop because he goes for doors too quickly.
You know never to go through an unsecured door, ever.
However, sometimes a movie will make a weird creative decision. You know, take a risk, do something kind of funny or interesting. And while the movie might not be great, it can be enjoyable to watch and talk about. Think of gems like Friday the 13th Part 6, our much discussed Saw 6, and Halloween Ends. Apparently, this is a controversial opinion. It's literally the only good Halloween sequel, outside of Season of the Witch. Whatever, we think it's quite good. These movies have a voice. They're not only made for profit and capitalist inertia, but they can be pieces of art that contain some kind of message, while also being entertaining. In this genre, they are often also surprisingly poignant, because they are the exception to the standard of the general slime that is found within the film industry. On the flip side, you have sequels that transparently chase profit, drenched in fan service and gratuitous deaths, often devoid of stakes, all blood and boobs. And let's just say that that's fine sometimes, because just because something is trashy doesn't mean it can't be fun. You know, we're far from being prudes. But there is a certain intersection between trashy and tasteless that makes something just not fun to watch. This includes egregious titles like Jason X, Halloween Resurrections, and indeed Saw 7. Despite their differences, they share some key commonalities. they're not really concerned with being scary. Rather, they turn the villains into rock stars. In the early stages of these horror franchises, the villains are genuinely terrifying, and the audience roots for the heroes. But somewhere down the line, the script flips, and these iconic villains morph into the only reason to watch. We're supposed to cheer for rather than fear them. This always happens in late-era horror franchises, and it's part of their charm. The films stop being concerned with the victims, and they try and build up the killer as the draw. Consider Friday the 13th Part 6 as the best-case scenario for this kind of thing. Jason is brought back to life with superpowers, and that gives the film some juice. His newfound super strength can be transferred into creative new kills. And since he was brought back to life by a character, there's also an element of drama as well as Pandora's box and all. The key takeaway here is that in this case, Jason isn't framed as cool. He's intimidating, a scary monster that no longer feels like a dude in a mask. For the polar opposite effect, consider Jason X.
Hey, Slappy!
Jason becomes a badass figure, and we are meant to rally behind him. Thanks to his action figure-like design, he's meant to look cool instead of being explicitly scary. The characters are knowingly awful, snotty, horny, and we're meant to root for Jason to kill these brats because that's why the movie exists.
Aw, shit! Forgot my arm.
Yeah, here you go, dumbass.
It also subsists because the studio wanted to rip off Aliens, but that's a story for another video. The pretense of fear has evaporated in favor of pleasing the fans as much as possible. Further consider another dogshit sequel, Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare, where the titular Freddy has lost all of his scare factor and the producers have turned him into Bugs Bunny. A cartoon character who happens to invent deadly pranks for our misanthropic delinquent teens. So it's something the studio thought would work because it maximizes profit rather than being artistically compelling. The film isn't scary, it's something to put on for little kids whilst their parents peruse the shopping center, which is all the more insulting because these films are made for adults. They have so little respect for their audiences, and Saw 7 mirrors that shift. Kramer's brief appearances come across as cheer-worthy moments not dissimilar from a Marvel movie, and Hoffman is the Terminator, a silent killer slowly striding through a police station killing everyone in sight. A lot of these movies that we've been talking about came out in the wake of Scream.
Freddy, that's right. I like that movie. It was scary.
Wow, well, the first one was, but the rest sucked.
Scream released at a time where horror movies were tired and dying. It reinvigorated the genre by holding a mirror up to itself. It didn't parody horror, but rather lovingly celebrated its own legacy while poking fun at itself. Following Scream, a new level of meta-awareness permeated the horror genre. These aging franchises become aware of their own legacies. Halloween H2O is aware of the trauma inflicted upon Laurie Strode in the original. It's more interested in how the violence affects its characters. These movies weren't truly self-aware, they were just meta in the sense of catering to the audience's expectations in regards to genre tropes. Consider Halloween Resurrections, widely regarded to be the worst Halloween movie, which is honestly quite a feat.
All clear.
Nothing above, nothing below.
The film was aware of its own place within horror history, with the original entry having popularized the slasher genre, and its answer to its own mediocrity is Dangertainment.
So you want to be on Dangertainment? Let's see what you got.
An internet show that's like hip with the kids? Or something? It's the difference between Scream being self-aware and challenging the notion that horror movies are not intelligent, and that self-awareness as a quick joke to the audience. The creators wink knowingly as they write boring teenagers ripe for slaughter. It's an excuse not to try or to be vulnerable. Saw is not immune to this horror self-awareness, but because the films are thrillers, they tend to go about their self-awareness in different ways. Saw has to be self-aware because every movie has to end in a mindfuck plot twist. Thus, they have to be knowledgeable about what the audience is thinking so they can stay a step ahead of them, knowing where to misdirect them and such. But Saw 7 has one particularly glaring problem in that regard, a true Achilles heel that makes it more convoluted, more egregious, and more bad. Chapter 2, Development Troubles. For the most part, horror sequels are made to please fans. The challenge lies in striking the delicate balance between coming across as authentic storytelling and not appearing desperate for attention. The Saw franchise has, for the most part, managed this balancing act relatively well. Relative to other horror sequels, of course, most of the Saw entries can be described as middling, which you can't really say about your Halloweens and your Hellraisers.
Say something smart.
Existence precedes essence.
You know, each installment seamless is a bit of a stretch, but each installment moves into the next, creating a narrative flow that, while often marred by jank, feels somewhat cohesive. Saw X, despite being a prequel to most of the movies, manages to slot itself into the timeline without too much error, even if it's a bit unrealistic for the cops who investigated the killings not to know about it. Look, Saw X is definitely one of the best sequels in the franchise, although it's not exactly high praise. The Saw movies were made very quickly, and the timeline is full of retcons that exist solely to trick the audience. But there's inertia to the first 6 films that's pretty satisfying. However, this comes to a screeching halt with Saw 7. The plot becomes so disjointed that it's challenging to invest in the overarching narrative. So, why did this happen? Why did the inertia crash and burn the way that it did? When you look at the behind-the-scenes drama, things really start to make sense. You see, the Saw movies dominated the Halloween weekend box office every year from the original up to Saw 5. It was the biggest horror franchise of the mid to late 2000s, but when Saw 6 dropped, things changed. It was dethroned by none other than Paranormal Activity. This would signal a shift in the horror genre, with audiences getting sick of gritty, bloody thrillers in favour of ghosts, demons, and found footage. Understandably, Lionsgate started to worry about the future of Saw. It would be such a big blow to them that they didn't think Saw could maintain many more sequels. The original plan for the franchise was to have 2 more films after 6, but Lionsgate only approved 1 more film, so the story elements of both got merged into one. That probably explains the haphazard plotting, but it doesn't explain how boring the film is, though. Like, a film that consists of 2 films worth of traps and plot should be more interesting. Look, we'll put a pin in that, we'll come back to it. Also happening around the same time was the 3D boom. After Avatar repopularized the format in 2009, pretty much every major studio started to copy it, with much less success. This is also happening in horror circles, with My Bloody Valentine, Final Destination, and Resident Evil all getting in on the action. It was a fad, a trend, and I can only imagine that Lionsgate forced Saw 7 to be 3D to make the final chapter as attention-grabbing as possible. The thing about 3D, though, is that it is expensive, crazy expensive, and this ended up ballooning the budget to be the largest of the Saw franchise at the time. Despite being more expensive than all the prior Saw movies, it looks the worst. Put another pin in that for later, okay? What's more, director Kevin Gore was not familiar with filming in 3D. This was his second feature film after Saw 6. 3D is hard to pull off and it requires a lot of preparation to get right. Time is not what they had when making Saw 7, as these movies typically have a quick turnaround, coming out every year. But that's not the only reason that Kevin Gore may have had a bad time making Saw 7. There's drama here. See, originally, the director of Saw 7 was going to be David Hackle, the man behind Saw 5. It was official and everything. Gore, after making his directorial debut with Saw 6, was in talks to make Paranormal Activity 2 with Paramount and Blumhouse. Kevin was reportedly very excited about this career move, and it was something new and exciting for him, and he'd be joining a hot new IP that everyone's talking about. After all, Kevin has spent a good chunk of his life on the Saw movies, having edited them from the very start. But Lionsgate didn't like that their guy was going to work for the enemy, so in a move that was purely to make things harder for the rival studio, they got their lawyers and they found a clause in Kevin's contract that they used to force him to make Saw 7. David Hackle was dismissed, and Kevin was dismayed. Imagine being in Kevin's shoes. You have to imagine that any energy or excitement that he had for the franchise began to evaporate pretty quickly. Not to say that he didn't care, as he was one of the most important people in the creation of the franchise. To make matters worse, most of the pre-production on Saw 7 was already complete, and Kevin walked onto set just 2 weeks before filming a big 3D studio movie.
I mean, I call that epic bad luck.
An interesting behind-the-scenes tidbit is that after this forceful hiring, Kevin did an uncredited comprehensive rewrite on the script, which caused problems as sets had already been built and actors had already been cast. It makes you wonder how much he changed and how much of it made it into the final product. The script would have already been messy, being a compilation of 2 films, but with these rewrites, I can only imagine that it got messier, which further explains how awful the final product is. Nonetheless, Kevin was not happy about directing Saw 7. Removed from Kevin Gruart's blog,
I just had the task of telling my 83-year-old mother that no, I'm not going to be allowed to direct the movie we were all so excited about when my family last got together, and that I'm being forced to leave town before getting a chance to see her again. Yes, I'll be filming people getting tortured yet again, so I'll have to put off me making a film she can actually watch for another year. I'm not making this shit up.
It sounds like the cries of help from a creative who's trapped within the studio system. No wonder Saw 7 sucks. It was directed by a man who didn't want to direct it. Chapter 3. Worse than you'd expect. The lack of enthusiasm for the content of the story, its juice, if you will, is further ruined / or made into piss by the ethos of the film. Saw 6 had a pretty solid ending. It's kinda dumb, but it's a real status quo changer, and Saw 7 doesn't exactly know what to do with itself. Saw 6 ends with the promise of a vengeful Hoffman going after Jill. In Saw 7 though, this storyline barely registers. After the opening sequence, Hoffman all but disappears from the narrative aside from a dream sequence and some videotapes, while Jill spends the entirety of the film in police custody. Not exactly how a tight thriller should be formed, eh? The story doesn't feel organic so much as it wants to please the audience by killing a much disliked character, which is fine, like whatever. It's dumb, it's a dumb horror movie, and the honest emotional investment I have for these characters is pretty low, but the way the film goes about its glorious murdering is problematic in our eyes. It's a bit tricky to describe this feeling because it's not a really concrete thing as much as it's kind of a vibe, an ick, if you will. This is particularly egregious because it's the ugliest one, the acting is terrible, and it's misogynistic as hell. The movie is desperate to be liked, resorting to cheap fan service and cheer-worthy lines. This could partly be attributed to the development troubles that we've talked about earlier, but it's not enough of an excuse. There are many aspects that combine to make the aura of Saw 7 to be the most off-putting of the franchise. Not to say that the movie can't be nasty. Saw 3 is so grisly and mean-spirited that it's a fan favourite. A film so nasty because it's bound up in the main character's grief and self-hatred. You know, just because a horror movie is a tinge horrific doesn't mean that it's bad. But it's a gratuitous nastiness that makes the film insufferable. Let's go through these pins then. The colour grading. This might be one of the ugliest movies I've ever seen in my entire piece of shit life, at least in regards to an expensive big budget affair. The Saw franchise has a distinctive look to it. It's very grimy and dirty aesthetic, all greens and browns and metallic blues. They're not meant to look pretty, but they're distinctive. They have a personality and you tend to warm up to them. The first 6 movies were shot on film, but Saw 7 was shot digitally with a 3D camera, all green shadows and pink blood. It does not have the grindhouse grime of the first 6 films. Like, we wouldn't say that any of them are fantastically shot, but the mistakes of the choppiness of the editing can be excused by the aesthetic itself. Saw 4, for instance, has really obnoxious editing, but you can't say that it doesn't fit the aesthetic itself. It was an experiment, and even though it failed, you remember it. Saw 7, by not conforming to the aesthetic of the franchise, stands out as particularly ugly, which makes it even more egregious because it was the most expensive one. Looking better wouldn't fix the script, but at least it would fit the rest of the franchise. Like, the color grading is so bad that I could just pick a frame from this film and instantly recognize it as distinct from the rest of the franchise. It's all pink blood and green backgrounds. Green is not an alien color to the franchise. Arguably the 2 most famous moments in the first film are Amanda's game and when Jigsaw closes the door on Adam. It's all lit in green. The latter is in the same room as the ending of Saw 7, so let's compare and contrast as to why Saw 7 looks as bad as it does. The first being the different types of camera. The first one was shot on film and the second was shot digitally on 3D, so there isn't any kind of film grain to give texture to the greens and blacks. Secondly, Saw 7 is broadly lit, giving little contrast to the frame. Perhaps because it was 3D, the frame is flatter and less interesting to look at. You can see everyone's faces perfectly, even though it's meant to be dark. Then there's the use of fog. It makes no sense for there to be fog in Saw 1 because it's just an abandoned building, but it looks atmospheric and James Wan likes fog, so they lit the scene to look nice. Like it looks in a movie, as movies should look like, as in movies. The darkness is darker, but it feels like more of a full frame. In Saw 7, he turns the lights off on Hoffman as a homage to the first film, but the frame is brighter than how it looked in the first film, with the lights on. Also, the invasive greens make Gordon look like Shrek. We can honestly go on and on, but instead of going shot by shot, further reinforcing our point, we would like to look at the trailers for the film, because in them, the film looks fine. Like, not great, but fine. Average. Let's compare some shots. In the trailer, the greens aren't as obnoxious, the blues and browns are more prominent, and the lighting looks more expressive and like how a movie should look. It's not uncommon for grading in a trailer to look different from the final film, but the contrast between these two is so staggering. And in case you think we're just making a fuss to make ourselves look smart, we point out that Kevin Gore agrees that the color grading is terrible. In a recent tweet, he said that he would like to remaster the film. It's simultaneously overexposed, and the color grading is murky, making it difficult to see the characters' expressions at times. And before you protest, we released the Saw 6 video with horrendous audio. You know, what do we know about quality? And you know what? Fair enough. But in our defense, our video didn't cost $17 million to make. We spent 30 whole Australian dollars on lunch. And this video we spent 20 whole Australian dollars on this chain. Bunnings Warehouse. And we would have refilmed it if we actually thought that anyone was going to watch it. Not unlike the final film in a series of famous horror pictures that are desperate to be watched to make a profit. Saw 7 is an eyesore, which makes the smug aura of the film all the more insufferable. The acting. The thing you have to understand about the Saw movies is that they don't cast you for being a great actor, excluding Tobin Bell, but that was more of a happy accident. They cast you because you can sell being in pain. So the side actors haven't always been the best at selling normal dialogue, and that's fine, because people pay their tickets to wince rather than to experience heartfelt monologues. But some of the actors in Saw 7 are truly awful. Let's start by talking about Gibson.
Well, here's my problem. That was left for me, and your fingerprints were all over it.
This fucking guy.
When you told me Hoffman had it in for you, you didn't mention that it was because you tried to kill him.
Gibson is our resident cop man guy. Every Saw movie has a cop man guy, like this one, and a less racist Wahlberg. But this guy, this fucking guy, cannot act for shit.
You're crazy. You know that? I knew you were crazy the minute I laid eyes on you. Crazy.
And it's frustrating because he kind of sort of has an interesting backstory. It's revealed a bit over halfway through the film that Hoffman saved him from an attack by a homeless guy, because all homeless people are dangerous. Great. Love that. Thanks, Saw. And Hoffman shot the homeless guy to save him. Gibson then reported Hoffman for police brutality, which led to Hoffman getting a promotion and Gibson getting demoted. Probably the most realistic thing that a Saw movie has ever done. This idea is more thoughtfully explored in Spiral, and it's the most interesting aspect of that movie. But in Saw 7, it's exposited and then left behind. Nothing interesting is done with this grudge, because Gibson is too preoccupied with being a dick. I particularly hate this shot, where he's walking by a female officer and he turns to perv on her ass, even though she's wearing long pants. You know, normal pants. It's honestly indicative of his character. He has this fratty aura that permeates his every single line read. He's bro cop, the cop that harasses all the women, just like all cops do. It's like Gibson has a chip on his shoulder and a motivation to get back at Hoffman, but instead of being a decent character with an understandable motivation, he's just a fucking asshole. He spends half the runtime berating Jill, and especially doesn't help that this character, with all of his baggage, is performed poorly.
The man he killed was released from Clear Dawn Psychiatric Hospital when the state shut it down. That building's been abandoned for years. That's where the game is being played.
His line reads oscillate between cringeworthy and bewildering. You feel nothing when he dies, despite being the deepest character in the film. There is nothing to hold on to aside from his weird misogyny. And then there's Jill. Ugh, fucking Jill. Do I have to talk about Jill? Can we just skip this part?
Wait, you didn't talk about Jill in Saw 6?
We didn't talk about Jill in Saw 6. Jill, the wife of John Kramer, could have been such an interesting character, but she's utterly wasted in this franchise. There is a line that one must toe when discussing this character because she's super boring and she's poorly acted, but most of the hate for this character comes from misogynistic nonsense. The kind of people who don't need an excuse to get angry at fictional women. That being said, Jill is a boring character who, despite being more active than Tobin Bell in this franchise, has no definable character traits, and she doesn't really do anything. The Saw franchise is not really known for its progressive treatment of women, but like, it's never really been all that gratuitous. The violence is more or less egalitarian, you know, just as many women are subjected to games as men. They're really just put into games for being women, you know? Like, in Saw 3, there's a lady who's frozen, and that's the most naked anyone ever really gets in these movies. But it makes sense within the film. She doesn't exist for the audience to leer at. I was rewatching part of Saw 6 recently, actually, and like, when they're in the carousel trap, and it's like, this fucking bitch, she's lying!
I'm pregnant! No, she's not! She's lying! She's fucking lying!
You know, like, Saw has always had a little bit of an ick, but it's not like, I'm gonna leer at a woman's tits kind of misogyny. It's just kind of like a fratty gross.
Yeah. That aspect really comes into play in Saw 7.
Yeah, Saw 7 is the worst for that. Yet, Saw 7 takes this to an uncomfortable level of misogyny. The entire film exudes a frat boy energy, and it becomes evident right from the opening trap. Traditionally, the opening traps in the Saw franchise serve as a thematic statement or the inciting incident for the plot, grounded in purpose. Saw 7 departs from this norm, as the trap feels disconnected from the oncoming story. The idea of a public trap is an intriguing one, but the script does nothing with it. Instead, it embodies the film's problematic attitude. The design of the trap, with a leering strap accentuating the victim's breasts, serves no meaningful narrative purpose. The character herself is painted as one-dimensional, wholly manipulative and encouraging us to root for her demise. She becomes both an object of desire and a figure of hatred, setting the stage for an audience to align themselves with a frat boy mentality of getting back at that crazy bitch who dumped me from not even washing my own asshole. The misogyny carries through the rest of the film. We've already mentioned the bizarre moment where Gibson leers at a fully dressed police officer. A significant portion of the misogyny is directed at Jill, who is labelled as crazy throughout the film.
He looks crazier than a sack full of cats. You're crazy. You know that? I knew you were crazy the minute I laid eyes on you. Crazy.
Like, so many times. It's really bizarre. She never raises her voice or acts strangely, and her performance is too boring to refer to with any shade of mental ill health. A part of me wonders if this is because the fans were not into Jill, so this movie, as the final chapter, spends a lot of time calling her names and taking joy out of killing her. Never more a literal impulse in the dream sequence of early in the film. Jill is portrayed in skimpy sleepwear, her nipples visually accentuated. The scene overtly underscores her attractiveness. The accompanying soundtrack in this scene doesn't generate tension, it's pulsating metal music, seemingly encouraging the audience to find it awesome when she's brutally torn apart. They kill her twice to maximize the joy of the audience. Going back to that insufferable quality of Jason X, where we aren't meant to feel empathy for these characters and not want them to die, but the opposite. We lust for their flesh because that's the primary vein of enjoyment this film wants you to feel. But Saw 7 feels so gratuitously cynical and sexist that you can't enjoy the film as trashy fun. Chapter 4. The Metaphysics of the Game. As of all Saw movies, there are two storylines going at once. In Saw 7, we start with the inciting incident for the cops, which is the horsepower trap. Part of me likes this one because it's kind of fun, there's lots of moving parts that keeps you interested, but it's emblematic of a tone shift between 6 and 7. We aren't supposed to feel for these characters. They are literal Nazis and therefore evil and they're devoid of humanity, and I agree with all of that, to be sure, but it doesn't make for compelling drama because they aren't people of whom I can empathize with. I like empathizing with people. It's part of being a human being. Instead, it's meant to be cheerworthy before it's interesting. It's a shift from tense fear to laughing violence. Contrasting this with Saw 6, where we don't like Easton at the beginning, but as we go throughout the film, we are endeared to him, the lessons he learned and the choices that he makes. These characters are all cartoons, and there's no complexity to their decisions at all. Also, I have a personal ick with the film, and it's not really the film's fault, but I always get uncomfortable when Chester Bennington dies in this scene. Just knowing that he committed suicide and all. I'm not even a fan of Linkin Park.
Dude, no fucking way, man. It's Linkin Park. R.I.P. Chester. Got my life in 2%. This is my last resort.
Anyways, the cops spend most of their time farting around investigating this single trap, and since Gibson is such a wet blanket of a character, there isn't anything interesting happening for this half of the film. It reminds me a lot of the monotony of Saw 5, where Hoffman and Strom are playing boring-ass cat-and-mouse games, so we're left to suffer with another protagonist. Little Bobby. Fucking Bobby. I do not like this man.
I have found someone who has truly become my rock.
Bobby is another theoretically interesting character. He's a grifter, and there hasn't been a character like him in the movies before. Jigsaw is upset because he lied about being in a trap for clout, so he punishes him in one. Once again, we have a Saw film with a simple message. Being manipulative and lying for attention is bad. Neat idea. But they totally fumble him, and it's one of the worst protagonists in the franchise. It's a bit meta. It reflects how, in-universe, the crazy events of the previous film would totally be newsworthy. So to have someone lie about being in a trap, essentially be a grifter over the whole thing, is kind of interesting. It's unique because you can only execute this idea at the end of a franchise. So I'm not against the concept of this story, but it's executed really poorly. It fumbles empathy in a really annoying way.
Why would you just shut the fuck up?
Let's compare with Saw 6 again. Easton is also a prick, but he begins to see the errors of his ways. The unfairness of his game, the ways in which he punishes innocent civilians, represents how unfair he has been in the healthcare industry. The grift has a thematic point that, no matter how out of place it feels in a Saw movie, makes for compelling drama. Easton has an arc where he learns something, whereas Bobby starts as a grifter and he ends as a grifter. He doesn't learn anything about lying to his girlfriend being bad, he doesn't learn about manipulating the feelings of Jigsaw survivors as bad, and it kind of reminds me of this documentary called The Woman Who Wasn't There. And I think that that film is a really interesting illustrative example about how this kind of story can be fascinating. In that film, we follow the life of a woman who pretended to be a survivor of the 9/11 attacks. She refused to be involved in the film, so we exclusively learn about her actions and words from the survivors of the actual attacks, and they speak about her with kindness and generosity. This woman helped organize events for survivors to heal, and she made very little money off of her actions. She just wanted to be friends with people and connect with others on a spiritual level. We don't just lie to grift, but to be seen by others with kinder eyes. And her lie was monstrous and horrific. But you understand her, and you've met people like her in your own life. Like, anecdotally, I knew a kid in high school who lied so hard that his family up and left the state and moved across the country. Shit like this happens. I have a crazy backstory. Subscribe for more of my backstory. I'm not keeping that. What makes Bobby so frustrating is that he's in it for the grift, and there's no emotional element to the game, and it feels utterly flaccid. Now, this could be entertaining, as Saw X does so well, but you have a rich psychology to play around with. And the film is so disinterested in it because it's more interested in being sadistic. And for a franchise that is first and foremost a series of psychological thrillers, it hurts my heart on a spiritual level to see them fumble this character so hard. But that isn't the only thing. Going back to Saw 6, Easton goes through the traps, and each trap represents an element of his company's policies. The smoker trap is unfair because thematically it reflects how unfair Easton's life policies were. Through the progression of the film, the value of life is demonstrated as Ethan has to pick who lives and dies. Bobby has a bunch of his friends killed because they went along with his lie. And that's the biggest difference between the two protagonists. It's retribution versus reparations. Saw 6 demonstrates the errors of its ways, whereas Saw 7 is sadistic because that's what the studio wanted it to be. For the audience, we think that he's going through these traps, not only because there are bombs on his limbs that motivate him forward, but because we believe that his family is at the end of the game. And even though this twist is a fake out at the end of the trap, Easton meets his sister, the investigative journalist lady. Bobby has to get through the traps to save his girlfriend. She's the only member of the publicist team that isn't in on the lie, so she's innocent and doesn't deserve to die in a trap. And many people have pointed out how unfair this trap is in practice, but she didn't do anything to deserve being burned alive and all. The most gruesome and drawn out death in the film she has. But I feel that people don't understand why they don't like this aspect. And it all goes back to the fratty misogyny of the script. This lady, Joyce, is the perfect example of a prop character. She has nothing going on aside from being an innocent damsel in distress. You can replace her with anything. A manuscript, a wad of money, a Blu-ray copy of Venom 2 Let There Be Carnage. Anything that Bobby doesn't want to lose in a fire. She is thus a prop for Bobby to struggle for. She has no character, she has no agency, she does nothing, and because of this, the whole game feels unfair. And she doesn't have a character because the writers didn't see her as a person, because the hot lady needs to be saved by Bobby. Something that's frustrating about this movie is that the game doesn't really have a point. Like, we really labored over that fact in the Saw 6 video, that the game is unfair because it reflects the unfairness of the healthcare system. Even if the message is pretty vanilla and it's kind of dumb, it still means something that has an internal logic to what Easton and us, the audience, are to take from the film. Similarly in Saw 3, the main guy, Jeff, is also at the center of an unfair game, but the arc of the film involves Jeff forgiving the people who involved in his son's death. It's unfair, but there's an emotional through line, and you understand why this character is struggling with this. In Saw 7, they lied! Bobby doesn't have to learn that lying is bad. He doesn't have to learn the value of suffering. He doesn't have to learn that the relationships are stronger when lies are not involved. He lied, his team lied, and they must be punished for lying. It's an unfair game without a lesson. Not exclusively because Hoffman is just doing it to fuck with the police, but because the creators didn't think terribly hard about the movie, so everything feels particularly unfair, and there isn't a narrative through line to cling to while experiencing the film. So, if that's the case, you would hope that the traps and the gore would carry the rest of the experience. Maybe the film is brain dead in regards to themes, but at least it's an entertaining experience. The traps in Saw 7 are so boring, visually and conceptually. They all just involve someone's throat or head getting injured in some way, shape, or form. There's very little variety going on. Let's start with what the fans call the Silent Circle. It's an interesting gimmick for the franchise, with the publicist who must now not make a sound while in excruciating pain because she was silent about Bobby's lies. It's the closest thing we have to a thematic trap in the film, but the way it's executed is really mean-spirited. Bobby has to urge her to be silent, lest the spikes approach her throat. But he keeps yelling at her and telling her to shut the fuck up, and it comes across like he has no empathy for her pain, as if he was more flummoxed and frustrated than invested in saving her life. The trap is more annoying than scary. We aren't invited to wonder if she would survive the trap, rather, we get annoyed by this character and her exclamations and wincing. All the blood in the film is pink at best, and the backgrounds, of which should probably be metallic blue and brown, is a disgusting green colour, and these two shades make the image particularly nasty to look at. Then we have a similar trap which fans dub the Impalement Wheel, which is like more interesting name than anything in the scene itself, like, oh no, he's gonna stab her in the eyes! What is that bottom one for? To make her throw up? I wouldn't throw up. Damn it, you made me laugh. I was gonna sit there for a whole minute. Look, he has to keep her alive by stabbing himself in the rib of a machine, and he fails for no other reason than it would be weird if these two people walked through the rest of the game. Visually, it's pointless, but for a trap that feels really pointless, consider the teeth trap.
Look to the chart as a reference for which teeth to pull.
He has to pull out his teeth to get a code. This is where I would like to reiterate that Saw 7 was made up of 2 Saw movies worth of ideas, and one of the final ones in the original series is a dude pulling out his own teeth for 5 minutes. Oh my god. Like, bottom of the barrel. Lazy. Jigsaw. Was Hoffman really run out of ideas in this one? Speaking of running out of ideas, what about the hanging trap? Like, oh no, it's a spicy trust exercise. These traps, all collected together, are so boring. I don't understand how this could have been the appropriate amount of excitement for a 3D movie. Oh my god, he's pulling out of his teeth! I went to the dentist once. Ooh, ouchie. That's the thing about this movie. Like, it occasionally has decent ideas. But whether they were distorted through the director's rushed rewrites, or whether they were salvaged from 2 different films, or whether they were truly out of ideas at this point, all those interesting ideas are presented in really dull ways. You don't feel tense when watching these characters because there's no pretext of tension of these characters living through these traps in the first place, because their deaths are meant to make the audience cheer before they invoke empathy. Saw has always been more of a thriller franchise than all-out horror. They're structured as mysteries, with a horror coat of paint. So without the pretext of the game, it just doesn't work because you just don't care about anything that happens inside of it. And like, that's fine. Both 4 and 5 have dubious plot construction. But what irritates me the most about Saw 7 is how expensive it is, how it looks the worst, how it's the most boring, how it's the most padded feeling, how it feels like the longest movie but it's the second shortest one, and how everyone is an unlikable prick who doesn't feel like a person. They're all hunks of meat, ready for consumption, and it makes me upset because it's so lazy. It is a desperate appeal to the fans, and in search of that, it got rid of all the most interesting elements of the film so people could just laugh at people dying. And look, we're not prudes. Give us a fucked up genre movie where people die brutally and horribly, and we'll be very happy. But this movie does the biggest crime a horror movie can be. Be boring. Chapter 5. Fan Service. The film is so desperate to be liked and to be profitable that I don't think it really can be classified as a movie. To evoke Martin Scorsese for a moment, it feels more like a roller coaster ride than a film. Now, we referred to Saw 6 as a roller coaster, but at least that speed machine is fun to think about. Saw 7 is flaccid and boring, and that is no better exemplified than with the return of Dr. Lawrence Gordon. You can practically hear the cheers of the cinema. The writers took a long-running fan theory and they turned it into reality, and it is, quite frankly, disastrous. This is the big twist of the movie, and it might be the most predictable one up until this point, so it lands with a thud. It's telegraphed to shit. The movie opens with Dr. Gordon right after the events of the first movie, putting his bloody stump of a leg onto a piping hot bit of metal to cauterize his wound. So, we know from the get-go that Dr. Gordon is back. His next appearance is at the survivors of a jigsaw meeting, where he ominously sits in the shadows before getting up to give a villainous monologue, like, oh, he's a bad boy, and he has an accent now.
I'm sure I speak for everyone here when I say how grateful we are.
So that happened because he cut off his leg? And that isn't until the end. We see that he survives, and then he looks kind of evil, then boom, at the end of the big twist, it turns out that he's been a jigsaw apprentice since Saw 2. They've done this twist so many times, and to even do it again after this movie, it's just not exciting. It feels dumb, it feels inorganic, and it's forced into the film because it's meant to be the final chapter, and they wanted to end it in a way that would shock and please the fans. One of the producers of Saw 7, Mark Berg, told a news agency in an interview that in Saw 7, we answer every question the audience has ever had. Really? Because it doesn't really feel like much answering is going on. The only answered question is in regards to Dr. Gordon. It seems that that was the entire focus of the movie, corroborated by Carrie Elway, who said in an interview,
I really have to thank the fans out there. Thank you for campaigning for me to return. They wanted to know what happened to Dr. Gordon, and so they wrote in a lot. Thank you for your letters. And they blogged a lot. Thank you for your blogs. And so we thought that this being the last in the series, it was appropriate to bookend the series with some answers for some of the questions about what happened to Dr. Gordon.
Okay, here's two things. First, the reason as to why Dr. Gordon didn't show up in the earlier films was because he was busy suing the film company for being stingy with money. He was owed like $1 million for his performance in Saw 1, and the studio didn't want to give him that. Secondly, this twist is frustrating because the Saw movies never organically ask the question what happened to Dr. Gordon. There's no search for him or anything. The first movie ends with him escaping the room to find help before Kramer gets up and shuts the door on Adam. Of course, it's entirely possible Dr. Gordon would encounter Kramer right after this, but it doesn't feel right to us that he'd become an apprentice, that he discovered a new lease on life. If you watch Saw 7 right after the first entry, the character progression doesn't work. It's a lot like Hoffman, actually, who makes sense as an apprentice for a while, as he's being blackmailed, but once Kramer is dead, it makes less sense for him to stay. He could just change his identity and leave the country. Ain't he a cop of resources, after all? The only thing that makes a small amount of sense in regards to Hoffman remaining an apprentice is his bloodlust. But Dr. Gordon? I don't see any motivation. And the new flashbacks Saw 7 give us to explain what Dr. Gordon was doing that whole time is more funny than anything else. The film gives the fans what they want, and that's why it's a bad twist, because fans don't know what they want. It's all fan theories, so when they actually put Dr. Gordon in the film to please and answer the fans, I guess it makes them happy, though the film is still poorly rated on all fan aggregate sites. But it feels incredibly forced in the world of Saw. It's not organic, it's shoehorned. It comes up at the end of Saw 7 like a hijacking. And this was how the saga was supposed to end. Dr. Gordon comes out of nowhere to become the new guy on top after barely doing anything. I think that it's very funny in flashback that Kramer tells him, without you, none of this would have been possible, to make us think that he's important. But all it really shows him is showing Kramer a photo of Dr. Lynn from the Saw 3 saying she'd be perfect. Like a little kid showing his dad a shitty drawing. Basically, we find out Dr. Gordon's job is to take care of Jill, and that's why this movie ends with Gordon locking Hoffman away in the same bathroom as the first film. Like, wow, it's not exciting or thematically resonant at all. It's not a nice bookend to the series. Speaking of lacking thematic resonance, Hoffman, bloody friar fuck himself.
I want to fuck a priest.
Catholic?
Yes.
A good one?
Yes.
Looks good in the...
Yes.
I understand.
The fan service angle of Hoffman in the eventual killing of Jill is not an exaggeration to say that the entire climax of his side of the film is killing her. It feels so gross. It doesn't entirely come out of nowhere, as Hoffman wrecks all the cops in that standout scene from Saw 6.
Right now, you're feeling helpless.
But that was out of desperation. It made sense for his character, and it had actual tension. Whereas in Saw 7, Hoffman turns into the Terminator, easily and effortlessly killing an entire police station's worth of people across 2 locations. This superhuman agility and cunning comes out of nowhere, and it only serves to get Hoffman and Jill in the same room so that the Hoffmanator can kill her again. We've already talked about how Jill is a non-character. She eats up screen time from the last 3 movies, and they're usually the least interesting parts. And because the acting is not very good, fans don't like her. So when the movie spends the time setting up Jill's death, twice mind you, it feels like fan service. You hate this character so much the writers seem to say, here you are, here's 2 over-the-top deaths. The ways in which she's killed is itself fan service. The mighty return of the reverse bear trap. The franchise finally shows us what this thing can do to you. And by doing it to Jill in the film's climax, it comes across as yet another please clap and cheer type moment. It's made especially egregious because the film completely disregards Bobby's half of the story in favor of Dr. Gordon and Jill's death. We made it pretty clear that we don't like Bobby as a test at all. But to spend half the film on it, with no wrap-up past his wife getting barbecued to death, is so telling about how little they cared about this character and his story. All of this is to say that Saw 7 sacrifices story in favor of fan service, and it is an utterly miserable experience because of it. Conclusion. I don't really like making negative videos. I would much rather uplift something I love and foster a closer connection to it. The whole point behind the Saw 6 video is that it took a risk, a silly risk, and it injected some juice into a stagnant franchise. I love it for that, even if the movie is kind of dumb. Saw 7 completely abdicates making any choices of its own, because it's only interested in being as crowd-pleasing as possible. Look, we spent a lot of time at the beginning of this video talking about Halloween and Friday the 13th and how those franchises have some stinky sequels. But the fact of the matter is, I think I would much rather watch Jason X or Halloween Resurrections again before I ever rewatch Saw 7. It saps the energy from your bones, and I wouldn't subject my friends to Saw 7 except for Peter. Fuck you, Peter, and the horse you rode in on. Well, that's the end of the video, I suppose. We don't have a twist this time around. Unlike Saw 7, we don't feel the need to shoehorn a twist for no reason. Thanks for watching, and consider subscribing at all. And how the hell do I get out of here? Peter, chuck me the key. No, you're supposed to throw me the key.
Oh.
I caught it in one go. Alright, let's go to bed.